Great. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's Open Democracy webinar. I am Adam Ramsay. I am an editor at Open Democracy, and boy, do we have a debate here for you tonight. I was warning the panelists earlier that I like to normally play a kind of friendly sort of, host type role when I asked to occasionally chair these things because my boss, Mary, isn't around or is too busy. But this is a subject close to my heart, and so I am going to be kind of mean to all four panelists tonight. I'm going to do my best to pretend to be like Jeremy Paxman or someone, which doesn't come very naturally. But tonight's subject, as you hopefully all know, is the question of the climate movement and socialism. And this all began when Extinction Rebellion, who I'm sure you're familiar with, tweeted to say that they're not a socialist movement. And perhaps Julian, who's kind of operating things behind the scenes, can show us that tweet now. And as he's doing that, you might have seen, if you're familiar with the kind of online debates, that there was what those of us in the industry call a firestorm, or you might even say a shitstorm online, globally, as people responded to that. And there was a raging argument about whether or not it is inherently socialist to demand action on climate change. So here we have the tweet. It come up, it says, just to be clear, we're not a socialist movement. We do not trust any single ideology. We trust the people chosen by sortition, like jury system, to find the best future for us all through a citizens' assembly. A banner saying socialism or extinction does not represent us. As a result, as you can tell, there's someone presumably waving that banner. Now, before we begin our debate with our current panelists, I'll introduce when we get there. Extinction Rebellion have very kindly recorded us a kind of 2.5-minute statement about this tweet. They wanted us to play at the start of this conversation, so that this is one of their spokespeople. And again, hopefully Julian can play this for us now.
Hi everybody, it's Claire Farrell here from Extinction Rebellion. I've been asked to send you guys a message about the We're Not a Socialist Movement tweet that went out during our rebellion in London recently. I'll start by saying that it should have had an addition that should have said all socialists are of course welcome. The aim of Extinction Rebellion is to be an umbrella canopy for people to come together and work together. An unbriefed spokesperson had recently also given an interview implying that we were struggling with serious infiltration by the SWP and our social media volunteers were being reactive. We did follow up with an extensive thread explaining this and aiming to help calm fears that perhaps we were just a stupid bunch of eco-utopian techno-fixers or green capitalists or worse, right-wing eco-fascist sympathisers. But of course, the fact still stands that we're not promoting any single political ideology, just a participating mechanism that could revolutionise our embarrassing, archaic and incompetent government. We stand by our third demand, introducing to help calm fears that perhaps we were just with a binding UK-wide citizens' assembly where some of the most difficult and important decisions can be made with integrity and long-term thinking, free from vested interests and lobbying pressure, and with everyday values at the forefront of the thinking. In my opinion, our most important demand is also the least understood. Humanitarian outcomes are the most likely result from citizens' assemblies. This is what's found across the board where these have been implemented. They are progressive mechanisms. And people are held in an empathic process alongside strangers, representative of our national makeup. Citizens rapidly overcome their differences, addressing issues of vital and urgent importance, often issues that politicians are simply too frightened to deal with. In assemblies, citizens deliberate like grown-ups, not like politicians who are bitching over the dispatch box. So we're trusting of the real meaning of democracy rather than the failed state of our UK politics, our national makeup. Claims to be a democracy, citizens but rapidly pushed around by billionaires, some of whom own the majority of our press, just saying, and are complicit in the deaths of thousands from austerity to COVID, and now sealing the deal on the genocide of failing to act on the climate and ecological emergency. So if you vote in the UK, whoever you vote for, the oligarchs seem to win, and I think nobody is coming to save us from them. Our similarities are far greater than our differences, and that's never clearer than in a crisis. And assemblies are a route to move beyond polarity towards empowerment and liberation. So I think put the power in the hands of citizens and we'll soon find out what compassion in politics could actually look like. And I, for one, trust strangers much more than I trust any political party right now. And the climate and ecological emergency means that our civilization is literally fucked. So why not dare to do something different? At this moment, facing such terrible odds, and with regards to so many urgent crises intersecting, we have very little to lose, I believe, except perhaps a few SWP placards.
Muted.
You're muted, Adam.
Apologies, I muted myself and then I forgot I muted myself. Thanks to Extinction Rebellion for providing that statement. I think you all got the idea, although I do think there were a couple of potential sound issues in this. I should say at this point that there might be various other sound issues throughout this. We're all in various places across the UK and many people in the chat or around the world. We have often at home, I'm at home. I should let you know that my dog is just there, and if anyone comes to the door, he'll go crazy, and that will cause chaos. So apologies for that in advance if it happens. But my first question is to Adrienne here. Now Adrienne, you, I think it's fair to say, would probably be quite critical of the Extinction Rebellion tweet and the position they take there. Is that a reasonable summary of your position?
Yeah, I think I would say that I thought some of the response to the tweet was maybe a bit over-exaggerated. What I find interesting about her response there is actually that in a lot of the comments she makes, I think she kind of makes the case for why their movement in particular and a lot of the environmental movement is socialist in a lot of respects. She talks about, ownership of the press by billionaires. She talks about, an unequally distributed humanitarian crisis and placing power back in the hands of citizens. And to me, those sound fundamentally like democratic socialist positions. And yeah, so I would be critical of it, not insofar as I think that Extinction Rebellion has to stand for one thing, but I think the reactionary sort of nature of it precludes the fact that a lot of what they do stand for are socialist principles, and the fact that the climate crisis is fundamentally a crisis of inequality in both its genesis and impact, and that's something that socialist policies are aiming to resolve as you work to decarbonize.
Okay, so I can see all that, but I guess what I'm confused by is your political strategy, in the sense that consistently for the last 2 centuries, people in England who've had the vote have pretty consistently voted Tory and have pretty consistently, if you're going to use socialist language, sided with the ruling class and the bourgeoisie, or they would not see it like that. They'd say, chosen the kind of traditional party of governance of the UK. And surely if we're going to have any kind of success in tackling climate change, we can't just ignore that political reality. We can't go around saying you've got to be a socialist to sign up for this project.
Yeah, and I don't think I would say that either. I don't think a lot of people who are on the socialist left demand that everyone, absolutely agrees with us. We have a set of principles that we recognize are, the best way to approach a climate crisis. But I don't think that just because people don't agree with you doesn't mean you shouldn't have a firm position on what you think is the right way forward. You don't win serious political battles by kowtowing to existing public opinion. I mean, just look at the Brexit vote. Prior to that vote, prior to it being called, 1 in 20 people who were voters identified the EU as an issue for them whatsoever. And 5 years later, that's been the absolutely dominant political conversation in the UK. And that's the result of, a very effective vote leave campaign saying this is our flag, planting it in the sand and working to change public opinion rather than chase it. And absolutely, historically, I'm not saying the left has been very good at doing what I've just said, but I wouldn't resort to, some kind of historical determinism there either to say that just because we haven't, succeeded in changing minds in the past doesn't mean that we won't. And I don't think people respond well to sort of not having a stance on things. I think as long as you're open to debate and to recognizing that people come from different places, having a strongly principled position is absolutely the way to go.
But don't you feel that, in the quite recent election in the UK, that's exactly what Corbyn tried. He put a fairly moderate, in fact, Green New Deal proposal, but the most radical there's been yet, to the people of Britain at a time of record support for action on climate change, and was overwhelmingly rejected. I mean, isn't that strategy tried and failed?
I mean, I would say that in that election, much to my chagrin, the Green New Deal and Green Industrial Revolution, aside from manifesto policies, featured, very little in the actual election campaign. And I would say, to your point, we can talk about Labour's Brexit position as being one that decided to chase public opinion, or what it thought that was, trying to appease both sides, not taking a principled stance, and ending up very poorly for them. I think that is the case quite the opposite you can look at something like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, which in the past a month or so has changed public opinion in the US as much as it did in the preceding 2 years. And that's not because it softened its demands or tried to soften its image. It's because it took an incredibly principled stance with positions like prison abolition and abolishing police departments. And while those principles might alienate some people, they have overwhelmingly succeeded in drawing not just a democratic base, but also independents towards supporting them, and shifting the Overton window on, what is understandable as feasible, what people think is reasonable. And that, for me, is the project of the environmental movement, is completely shifting the debate on what we think is reasonable and what we think is possible, rather than chasing public opinion on something that, frankly, has put us so far off track that we're, on track for absolutely catastrophic climate impacts.
Okay, thank you. And Sonny, I'm going to come to you next. And if my questions for Adrienne were about politics and political strategy, I'm going to ask you about economics. And specifically, I'd like to ask, are you familiar with Jensen's paradox, with the Kazum-Brooks postulate?
I don't think so.
Okay, so in kind of classical economic theory, if you increase the efficiency of the machines you use to consume a resource, then you don't reduce the amount of that resource that's used, because what happens is the price goes down, and so people will buy more of it. And so the Kazum-Brooks postulate, where two economists, including the chief economist at the International Energy Agency, or International Atomic Agency, looked at demand for energy, and what they found was that if you increase the efficiency with which energy is used, that doesn't reduce the amount of energy that's used. You increase the efficiency with which oil is used, that doesn't decrease the amount of oil that's used in a market system. What it does is mean people people buy more oil instead with the money they have. And so the amount of oil that's consumed stays the same. So in the world at the moment, with the market as it is, what we see is a system where lots of people are buying electric cars. That puts downward pressure on the price of oil. The result of that is that more other people buy 4x4s, and the amount of oil that's consumed stays the same. That is the paradox of the market system. So my question is, do you really believe that in that system, it's possible to reduce consumption of oil?
We've just been doing that with the consumption of coal. So I don't see why it shouldn't happen with oil. I mean, the market will go towards whatever is the cheapest way to provide energy. And so far, as you know, in the UK, we've just spent months and the longest period of time using renewable energy. So it's easily possible. We just did that with coal.
Have we? I mean, isn't there also a massive expansion of coal power stations in India and China, across much of the developing world?
Well, in China, it's different, right? Because, of course, in China, they have so many reserves of coal, it's easy for them to do that. But in the UK, the United States, I mean, the coal industry is, if you look at it, is currently in a state of collapse, with all the biggest ones, especially the United States, going bankrupt. So, the coal industry is, well, let me step back a little bit over here for a second, because, it's also one of the things that socialists always argue is that the problem here is capitalism, and capitalism is driving this. But if you go back 20 years, socialism in this country itself was about protecting the miners, protecting the coal industry, heavy industry, rooted in those working class jobs. There was no focus within the socialist debate around the environmental movement or protecting the environment. You and I know this because we, for a long time, were trying to get the Labour Party and parts of the left to talk about the climate movement. So inherently, it's not true that just socialism is the way, is going to be this perfect system protecting the environment, and capitalism won't. And that's what I'm trying to say in a broader context. Specifically to your question, yes, coal has already fallen sharply off. I don't see why that's a problem for oil.
Well, so I mean, just to go back quickly on this, and then we'll move on. As you said yourself, the reason that China continues to consume coal at a high rate is that they have large supplies of coal. You know, the constraining factor on the resource that's going to be extracted.
The prices of solar energy and wind energy is falling exponentially. I mean, it was at some, it was like
the market does is
10 higher 10 years ago, and it's falling so quickly that I don't see that being an issue for long.
Well, but what the market does is use both the oil and the solar. You know, the energy consumption expands to fill the amount of energy that it can get cheaply, which includes the oil, and the planet can't cope with that, surely.
Sure. No, I'm not denying that. I'm saying that oil is going to be difficult to displace, but I don't think that gets away from my argument, which is more broader, and that actually this idea that capitalism and the system that we live in, the market economy, cannot be given incentives to move away from just a coal-driven or an oil-driven environment is totally not true. And it's being disproven across the world right now. So, you know, this argument that people make, which is that, oh, the market can't do it and we should just leave the market, and, you know, it's been proven that, of course, the market is impossible. I mean, look at China and the Soviet Union. They were big investors in factories. It's factories where all this, environmental damage is coming from. So the idea that a socialist or a communist system was somehow more environmentally friendly is just not true. So that's what I'm saying. We can give the markets strong incentives to invest in lower energy. We can give them direction so that the infrastructure is created for a different way of life. It's all possible. It's happened before.
So to put it another way, do you think that we can have the kinds of radical reduction in fossil fuel consumption and, you know, particular kinds of farming that we need to have without significant democratic control over the energy system, over the transport system, over the food production system, over the way we provide housing, etc.? Do you think the market?
We need to win elections for a start. This is the point that I go back to, and, you know, so I don't think Adrienne answered that question either, which is, how do you win elections? If you're saying to people, we don't care about public opinion, we care about making an argument, that's fair. That's a fair argument to make, but that's not going to win you elections, right? We still have to win elections in order to, and then convince people, 60% of the public, that this is the way forward for our lives, because we need to change direction. And if 60% of the public go along with you and say, okay, yeah, these guys have a point, then you can carry on, and those changes will be set in stone. If you win by an election by 40%, and then the next time, in 4 years' time, a Trump-like figure comes in, or someone else, and says, no, actually, this is rubbish, we're changing course, then it's, you know, then it's a very short sort of program.
I get your political arguments, Sonny, and, you know, I've had that conversation with Adrienne, but what it sounds to me that you're, you know, when you answer my question the way you did, so my question was, surely we have to have significant democratic control over a whole range of industries in order to address this crisis. And that is a system which is socialistic. You know, whether it's socialism as a binary is another question, but it means, you know, significant democratic control over huge amounts of the heights of industry. And probably also who's deciding investment. Do you, you know, you answered my question about that by talking about political strategy. So can I ask you again, you know, do you think that we can address this crisis without having significant democratic control over those industries and over how we allocate capital?
Depends which industry, right? I mean, I think that, for example, energy production, you could make a good case to the public as well, that we give them a public option which takes the whole industry in a particular direction. So I wouldn't be against that.
What about the food production system?
I think you're absolutely right. Even in the food production system, the government's going to have to have heavy regulation or heavy intervention in order to make sure that things go in a different direction.
Transport,
I think probably when you've got entrants like Tesla and other companies coming in, the government has to be much more specific and say, perhaps we invest in R&D or battery technology. But I don't think that you're going to suddenly take over Toyota or any major transportation company in order to get that goal. But you can provide certainly incentives and a regulatory market for those companies so they can go in that direction.
Okay, so you want a kind of significantly controlled market system, a long way to the left of where most Western countries are now.
No, we already have a significantly controlled system by the virtue of the fact that there's strong regulation in place for car companies, for a lot of other companies.
But I mean, would you ban
Ofgem, for example, regulates the energy companies. You can do a lot more to give them different incentives and say, make the case to the public and say, this is why we're doing it. So it's not impossible to do it within the current system.
Okay, I'm going to move on because I feel like we've had a good back and forth, and we're going to get chance for others to come in. But I'm going to go to Gaya next, and then I'll come to you, Sam. So Gaya, I want to have a quick chat with you. So you are, as I understand it, very involved in kind of what you might call social movement politics. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I think that works.
And so I want to ask you about social movement theory, because surely, in that sense, Extinction Rebellion are right here that it's their role to provide a broad platform, a pluralist space for people to take action on an issue without having to sign up to a whole agenda.
So I actually admire a lot of what XR is doing. I think they have shown us that they've been quite competent at building a strong movement over the last few years. Now, I strongly believe that movement politics is what brings transformational change. But what we've seen with movements that have been successful is that they've had clear principles and they've stuck to them. And now Extinction Rebellion has a strong focus on systems change, but its critique isn't focused enough on the real blocks here, the capitalist system. And I feel that there's not enough attention to that. It was really interesting listening to the address, and as Adrienne said, a lot of the things that they were lifting up were essentially issues with capitalism, the fact that real democracy has become co-opted by elite interests, that we have oligarchs ruling the press, ruling the economy. What puzzles me about the XR movement is that they haven't gone the next step, which is to say the system that we're critiquing is capitalism, and therefore we need to confront it, we need to change that system, and in order to do so, we need to be embracing anti-capitalist approaches. And I don't think the left, I mean, I would consider myself a socialist, but I don't think we have to be so dogmatic to say everybody has to be a socialist, but you have to embrace the values and the principles of anti-capitalist movements. I think some of the best anti-capitalist movements right now are actually indigenous movements, and they've played a very strong leadership role in climate action. So, I mean, drawing from these strong traditions that are out there, these solutions that are already out there that tackle exactly the problems that Extinction Rebellion have identified, like, why wouldn't you draw from the movements that are already out there to make this movement more successful? I think my fear is that this will be a failed movement if it doesn't tackle the root cause of the problem.
But do you think that, because there's a difference between targeting a particular target, you might say, the oil industry or whatever icons of, to use the socialist language, capital, or whatever big businesses are to blame, is one thing. Explicitly aligning yourself with a word, socialism, and a set of ideas which connote in a whole load of people a whole set of things that terrify them. Surely that's a risky strategy for any social movement. Surely you're just going to turn off about half people who might show up and participate.
Well, I think it's really interesting that one of the most recent protests that XR led was against the corporate-owned media. And the fact that they called out the Rupert Murdoch-owned tabloids for their false reporting on climate change. And I think the parallels are very interesting here, because essentially what elites have been doing for a while, and corporations, is manipulating the message. They've manipulated the message on climate change for decades. We know that. We know there's a paper trail. They're now being actually hauled up in courts for their role in climate denial. We're seeing a similar pattern in the press, and Extinction Rebellion have rightly focused on that. I think it's very similar when it comes to socialism. Socialism, and especially the kind of modern socialism that the Labour Party has been embracing the last few years, which is very innovative, not at all doesn't have at all similarities with the kind of, you know, like everybody always reverts to, oh, look at China, that kind of like top-down state capitalism. This is democratic socialism. We're talking about public and democratic ownership, more democratic involvement, democratization of the economy so that it's not captured by elite interests, so that people actually have a say over the policies, and it's not some farcical democracy where people who are rich have a far greater say over what policies we adopt than ordinary people on the ground. So I think in a sense, what Extinction Rebellion is trying to do, and it itself has been accused of being doing things that are unpopular. So I think if you hold socialism to the same standard as Extinction Rebellion, you would say that we both have, you know, we're both challenging the status quo, and of course we will be painted as unpopular because of that.
Okay, and I'm going to come to Sam now. Sam, you are a Tory and a climate activist. Is that a fair description of you know? I don't want to put labels on people they don't sign up to themselves. But
yeah, I'd say I kind of work in the policy world, like speaking to MPs, and I used to be a government advisor, and yeah, so probably more in the sort of policy making space than activist.
It's what activists.
I'm very passionate about climate change.
You're a climate action enthusiast, let's say.
Indeed.
Now here's my question for you. So you know, Sonny is correct to say that the market system, to some extent, has got at least the UK out of coal extraction and consumption. But of course, what he also referred to when he was speaking earlier was the fact, essentially, that the way that happened left sort of economic devastation across large swathes of the UK that we still see today. The old coal mining areas have, you know, real problems. And I grew up in, not that you guess my accent, but the northeast of Scotland. So the kids I went to primary school with, you know, huge numbers of them, the ones who were good at maths, went off to work in the oil industry in the North Sea. And I can absolutely see how a market system would lead to the, you know, reduction of the oil extraction in the North Sea, maybe even the elimination of it. But what I suspect that would do, without some kind of significant government intervention, is lead to the economic devastation of the communities I grew up in. How would you respond to that?
So I guess I would say that as we transition out of fossil fuels, out of oil and gas, out of diesel car manufacturing, all these other industries that we still have to phase out if we're going to meet our climate change targets, we don't have to repeat the same you know, industrial policies of the 1980s. And I think you can still do that. You can still have a more supportive industrial strategy within a capitalist system. So you can have reskilling programs, you can have industrial policy, things like R&D, things like capital grants, things like loan guarantees to make sure that businesses in the areas which are losing the fossil fuel jobs can set up and can develop clean energy solutions. You can then export those technologies that they make around the world and support jobs in those areas that have lost them from the decline in fossil fuels. And I think all of that is possible in a market-based economy. I think that just in the 1980s we were wrong to not try and cushion the blow and help those communities find access to alternative employment. But I don't think you need socialism to do that.
Okay, so then moving that argument onwards, we had, you know, I'm sure that everyone on this panel, well, I shouldn't assume, but I think it's likely that you would accept, as everyone else, that whatever we do about climate change, we're going to see quite radical changes to the climate in the coming decades. And that will produce more and more natural disasters, that will produce, you know, particularly devastating impacts for the poorest countries in the world, some of the poorest people across the world. Doesn't that mean that inequality becomes much more of a problem than it was before?
Yes, I mean, I think it does. And I think that is one of the reasons why, you know, anyone would want to tackle climate change. I don't think it's anti-conservative to want to improve the life chances and the quality of life of people on the lowest incomes or people in developing countries. You know, there was a conservative government that enshrined 0.7% target on international aid in law, for example. I don't think that's incompatible. So I don't think we disagree on that. Or are you saying that therefore to sort of counteract? Yes.
Well, I'm saying that if, you know, that if we're going to think about the impact of climate change and the scale they're going to have on, you know, people across the world, but particularly on the most marginalized and poorest communities. Surely we need pretty significant intervention in order to stop that having devastating impacts on the poorer countries in the world.
I think there's a lot that needs to happen on the sort of climate adaptation side of things. You know, I think it's really important, for example, that the developed countries meet their commitment, which was made at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015, to provide at least $100 billion of aid every year to developing countries. You know, and I think it's right that those countries as well go further and faster in reducing their own emissions, given that they've had a sort of historic share of the kind of global carbon budget, if you like. And I think, you know, those are commitments that a Conservative government in the UK signed up to in 2015. Yes, I mean, I agree with you that the developed countries have a greater responsibility on this. And I think, yeah, I think countries which have capitalist systems are doing that.
I mean, are they, or are they just outsourcing their emissions to the global south? I mean, you know, surely what we've seen in recent years isn't the success of sort of predominantly capitalist, the leading capitalist countries in reducing emissions, just the offshoring of their emissions.
I think offshoring is a potential problem. I mean, I think there are a range of factors behind the decline in manufacturing in Britain and other Western countries. I think you've got to look at, you know, labour laws and other things, as well as sort of climate policies, which have made those industries less competitive, if you like. And I think, you know, as we go further reducing our emissions here, I think we do have to watch out for just offshoring emissions, particularly to, you know, to jurisdictions that will have weaker climate policies. You know, there are ideas that people have talked about, for example, like a carbon border adjustment tax. So as we, if you're importing a product that had been made in a country with weaker climate regulation, the importer would have to pay the sort of effective carbon tax that an equivalent UK producer would have to pay. You know, and that, for example, is you know, is an example of a market mechanism where you can hopefully tackle that problem of offshoring. Because, yeah, I agree, it's a problem, you know, for those those countries where you're sending the heavy industry to, which is then creating lots of pollution and problems in those countries. But obviously, it also here in the UK, it's costing jobs, and it's hitting our sort of industrial heartlands and employment in those areas as well.
Sure. I'm going to go to the audience now. I was going to ask a follow-up there, but I've decided perhaps that getting into the details of policy around these things is maybe not for this audience. But yeah, thanks for that. And I think that, so I'm going to go to a question that we have that kind of comes back to some of the politics of this, which is a question. Let me just get her name up. So it's it's a question from Dylan Thompson, which is, what's the best historical comparison for the kind of political mobilization needed to enact the policies required to stop climate change? So, you know, when we look back in history, and I see Gaya's got a hand up, what movements should we be learning from when we think about this? And what does that tell us about this question? I'm going to go Gaya first, because she's shot her hand up.
Well, you know, I was thinking about movements, and, you know, like major movements have been like the civil rights movement that, you know, there are parallels to what XR is doing to them. But I also wanted to talk about political moments in time when we've faced crises like this. Because essentially what we're talking about with climate change is a massive crisis. And what I'm hearing from Sunny and what I'm hearing from Sam is the kinds of actions that, you know, the kinds of common or garden policies and economic trajectories you would pursue in basically 30 years ago when you didn't realize that climate change was happening, and hoping that prices will go down, and hoping that, you know, a bit of policy here and a fund there to support some adaptation might help. But we're in the middle of a crisis. So if we're thinking about points in time where we faced a crisis and the level of response that is required for that, we're talking about things like massive depressions, which is exactly why the Green New Deal is called the Green New Deal. It was in reference to the Great Depression in the US and the public investment-led mobilization that was used to really successfully counteract that. Other moments in time that, that the UK is familiar with, this is in a war situation. When we were being bombed by fascists, sorry, can I just finish my point? When we were being bombed by fascists, we didn't say, can we give some incentives to companies to produce some artillery? Or, like maybe we can reduce a little bit of tax here or put a tax on this so that people won't use steel for other things. No, they actually put a massive tax on automobiles so that people wouldn't be spending all their money on cars. They commandeered businesses. This is the level of threat that we are facing. And I think that's what people aren't quite absorbing. Like there's a very specific reason why it's called the climate crisis. And it's not just for semantics, it's because we are facing a crisis with a clock counting down on us.
So Sonny, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I fully agree with you. This is a massive crisis. I more than anything else, I tweet about climate change. I read articles about it all the time. I've written in the past about it fills me with paralysis that I have to talk about this with my family and even my broader family about the climate change, and feel like, how do you even give them hope if they think that everything is going to fall apart in 20 to 30 years? So, the issue is not that I don't know, I'm not speaking for Sam, but issue is not that I don't feel this is a massive challenge and the biggest one that we face. I think the issue is, though, that there are two issues. Firstly, that I don't believe a lot of people are listening to our message because they don't trust us, and we are not solving that question, okay? So, and by that, I mean the fact that they don't trust socialists and they don't identify with socialists. So the message that you are getting across to them is simply not hitting them, or even if it is hitting them, they look back and think, these guys are exaggerating. These guys don't know what they're talking about. Because of course we're all like that. We as humans, people that we dislike, we will just ignore their message or play it down or sort of make excuses for it. And we're seeing that right now during the pandemic, whereby Trump supporters are saying, these guys are just exaggerating, science is rubbish, all this kind of stuff that's bubbling up. It's for that reason. So fundamentally, we have to answer the question about how do we get so many people to trust us and listen to our message. And my biggest thing is that no one is answering that question. It's easy to just carry on saying that this is the biggest crisis that we face. But if other people are not listening to you, then they're just gonna move on with their lives. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And, so we have to answer that question. And so, sorry, the second part of the question was Adam saying, have you seen a recent mobilization like this? Yes. As I said in my article, we did this in the 80s with the ozone layer, which was also, by the way, an existential crisis. At that point, climate change scientists were saying that this is going to kill people, a lot of people. And we actually got people together and they managed to do something about it, And so, but at that time, it was Thatcher and Reagan leading that charge and saying, okay, initially they didn't agree, but eventually they said, okay, we need to save our planet. We need to do this and get this done. So they did. And it happened. Montreal.
Just to push back on that, Sonny, though, I mean, the current global economy has been built over the last 200 years on fossil fuels. The global capitalist system was never built on chlorofluorocarbonates. The Montreal Protocol, you're right that the hole in the ozone layer was a massive, massive problem, but it was quite an easily solved problem. You just had to regulate fridges and aerosols. That's not the same as regulating your whole energy supply, surely.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we didn't have a big solar industry 10 to 15 years ago. And, 30, 40 years ago, everyone thought that nuclear energy was going to make everything obsolete and the price of energy would be negligible. So obviously we are learning and we're adapting, but over the last 10 years, if we look at the price of solar and wind power, it has gone down massively. So already the dynamics within the industry are changing. And I think the left has to recognize that and say, okay, if they're changing, how can we work with that rather than dismissing it and saying that, this is nothing.
Sam, you had your hand up. So Sam, then I'll come to you, Adrienne.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, so just build on some of Sonny's points there, actually. So I, talk about, we need to act like we're in a crisis, and I agree with that, and it is painfully frustrating how slow things go, and I do completely accept that. What I would say though is that I think we have shown in the last few years that things can change quickly. So in the climate debate, so for example on coal-fired power stations, at the start of the last decade, coal was 30–40% of our electricity generation mix. It's now basically zero. We've had whole months without any coal. We've gone from I think in 2010 we had something like 4% of our renewable of our electricity mix was renewables. It's now nearly a third. You know, and that's massive change. Whole new industries created, whole communities changed by these new technologies in the space of a few years. And you've seen the results. We've got the quickest decarbonisation rate of any G20 economy in the UK. So I do think you can do this quickly. Now I think we now need equivalent policies in the other sectors, so that we can get similar transitions happening elsewhere. But I do think it can happen. And as Sunny says, the key thing I think is the technology cost. That once you reach this point where solar and wind become cheaper than fossil fuels, you hit a tipping point, and coal no longer is economically viable. And that ultimately, I think, is what will drive coal very quickly off the system in places like India and China, once it becomes cheaper to build a solar farm than it does to run your coal plant.
Thank you, and Adrienne.
Yeah, I'd love to just respond to a few points. So, I mean, Adam, I would agree with your response to Sunny there on the Montreal Protocol, and just to Sunny's point about the fact that, what was unique about the Montreal Protocol was that, it was quite a simple thing to replace, and there were immediate replacements available. And so when we talk about solar and wind now being affordable and available as replacements, in some respects, that's true, but there are extremely, extremely finite limits on how much that is true insofar as the resource use required to actually completely decarbonize the energy system and go to solar and wind power and other alternatives, given current rates of sort of economic growth, energy consumption, and how fast those are continuing apace. And that's where I think that falls apart, because a recent sort of systematic meta review of over 11,000 papers published in Nature found that decoupling emissions and resource use from current GDP growth, conclusively found that simply wouldn't happen. And so, you might have some relative decoupling, as we've seen, of GDP growth from emissions, for example, in the UK and a couple other global North countries. That simply isn't replicable on a global scale. And so that's where I think that falls apart, is when we look beyond our own borders and we have to think about, how do we do this for the world over? And we have to think about the fact that, the production of emissions and consumption of resources, degradation of the biosphere, that is overwhelmingly committed by wealthier nations as well as wealthier populations within those nations. And we need to look at, how do we rectify that problem? That's the diagnosis that matters. And that's where, for me, and I think for Gaya as well, sort of an anti-capitalist, and particularly sort of an anti-finance-led sort of libertarian capitalist, if you will, system is just incompatible. And so when, Sam touched on the fact that, a lot of policies he mentioned there, I would agree with, a supportive industrial strategy, reskilling, technology transfers to the global south. And I would agree with you that, a number of those policies, which a lot of Green New Deal motions called for, including Labour's, aren't incompatible with a capitalist system. I definitely agree with you there, but I think, there are several other things that are, and just physical resource limits are one of them. And the other is the justice component. There is no way to decarbonize globally, to produce the adaptation we need without radical reductions in inequality, both within countries and between them. And that is something that the capitalist system has proven that it is incapable of doing, at least under current conditions, if you look at how inequality has risen over the past several decades. So I think, that for me is just an irreconcilable problem with the current system. And it's what's led us to be so off track. And I just wanted to really briefly go to the point of trust. And I briefly saw someone mentioning in the chat, people aren't scared of socialism. They're scared of a label that's been, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of a lot of people, very misconstrued by press, by histories of regimes that I wouldn't say have anything to do with modern democratic socialism, and is raised as a sort of specter or boogeyman that is completely unrepresentative of what it is. And when you actually present policy that come from sort of socialist programs, or you might describe as democratic socialist in a way. So public ownership of railways, energy systems, water, democratic ownership of other systems, higher taxes, redistributive policies. Poll after poll shows that when presented discreetly, these policies are actually quite popular because they're very reasonable and people support principles of justice, of equity, of fairness. And those are policies often decried as socialist when presented under, a Corbyn agenda, for example. But ultimately, they're things that people support. And so you build trust with people, not by hitting them over the head with a label like socialism, which I don't think anyone is really doing, but by actually advocating things that impact their lives, that make sense to them, and that, they can support based on their own ethical values. That's how you build trust.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to move on. There are loads and loads of questions pouring in, and rather than kind of sifting through them live, what I'm going to try and do is just summarize what I think I've seen from a few of them, and also some of the ones that were submitted beforehand. And I'm going to come straight back to you actually first, Adrienne, on that last thing you were talking about there, because I mean, surely another way to put that, you say that the label of socialism, the term socialism has been brutally disparaged, but the actual ideas are very popular. And if you kind of take a sort of traditional left analysis of why that's happened, what you might say is the power of vested interests is such that they will always smear socialist ideas and, whatever you call them, to the extent that they can't win in electoral programs. And that's how, that democracy is skewed by the power of capital, to use the socialist language. And surely if we accept that that's the case, and that, does appear to be the case, and we accept the urgency of the climate crisis, then there is a kind of demand for finding a different route, that if you can't overthrow the vested interests which consistently beat you politically, and the only way to solve this crisis is to overthrow them, then you've got to find a way through that challenge, surely.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, that is a quagmire that has led us to where we currently sit. However, I think you have seen a massive turning of the tides towards socialism over the past, 5-10 years, whether that's AOC, Bernie, yes, he didn't win, but the amount of support for the kinds of things he stood for has, completely shifted in his 2 presidential runs. And, Corbyn, yes, lost elections, but the sort of shift again in the Overton window and what people consider reasonable policies, including the Conservative Party, which continues to, couch things in the language of the Corbyn-McDonnell project to use some of their policies, those shifts matter. And so I think, you're making progress along the way, and I don't think that it's great to just sort of give up on that. And to the point about urgency, I think what we've tried to do in the past is to take sort of the centrist position. So you can look at the Obama administration, you can look at the Trudeau administration in Canada, and progress has been quite poor when you're trying to appease all sides of the aisle. And so I don't think that has particularly worked either. I think given the urgency that we have, leaving things to market mechanisms will simply not suffice from a justice perspective, nor will it suffice from sort of a rapidity perspective. If you can take oil majors' capital expenditures on renewable alternatives as an example, which over the past decade was just over 0.5%. That's not the kind of pace that we need. And so I think the urgency demands sort of radical positions, and taking radical positions does shift opinions. But I mean, yeah, obviously I'm not saying that's going to happen immediately, and it is, a very challenging thing to overcome. Political transformation doesn't happen immediately, I suppose.
And I've got a similar question for either Sam or Sonny, and I'm happy for either of you to jump in, which is about the sort of power politics of this, which is, if you have a free market system, as we do, you have a sort of essentially capitalist system, then surely what we see at the moment is that it produces people and organizations, oil companies and, oil barons and so on, with an enormous amount of political power that they accrue through their wealth, who work very hard to ensure that we don't get the kinds of policies which you advocate, Sam, which you were calling for, Sonny. And surely without regulating quite significantly, whether you call that socialism or not, but without serious controls on the wealth of the wealthy are going to continue to have such power in the political system, you're never going to get the kind of action that we all agree that we need on climate change, whether we call that action socialist or we have more market mechanisms that the two of you are more in favour of. I don't know. I don't mind which of you answers that.
John,
Sam,
you
sure.
go. Shall I go? Okay. So I mean, I think lobbying, lobbying is an issue. It definitely is there, and there are companies that have made investments that are trying to get an extra bit of value out of those investments, and so push for favourable policy. But I would say that we are now at the point, I think, in the sort of clean energy transition in the UK, that we have a lot of really strong incumbent industries in the renewable sector, in the electric vehicle sector. And we've even got kind of, this week, for example, BP and Shell came out to back an earlier phase-out date for new petrol and diesel cars. They want to bring it forward from 2040 to 2030. So I do think attitudes are changing in the corporate world, and I do think increasingly corporates recognise, they recognise the seriousness of the kind of climate change commitments that governments have made and the legal targets that are in place. But they also recognise the need to act and to not, make our planet inhospitable, which obviously ultimately would be very bad for business. But the other point I wanted to make was that I just wanted to sort of slightly reframe the kind of climate problem from a sort of slightly more market-based perspective. So I would say that really what has got us in this mess is that we've had a kind of free rider problem. We've had companies that have been allowed to impose these costs, these external costs on society, which the rest of us have then had to pay for in terms of the flooding cost, the effects of heat waves and the health service and so on. And really, the way to fix that, which is essentially a market failure, is to internalise those costs so that polluters have to bear the costs of the pollution that they've caused. And I think if policy can do that, at the same time as also encouraging the creation of these new clean industries, I do think that offers us a way to see how a market economy might tackle climate change effectively. And if you do that soon and quickly, then I don't see any reason why the urgency issue, will be a problem.
So just, we can come to your second point in a moment, but on the first one, I just wanted to kind of give a brief anecdote, and I'm going to wrap up soon. But I was at the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, and I was, chatting to David Hone, who's Shell's head of climate change. And he, said to me, and I've got the recording still somewhere, that basically, of course, we say in public that we, want the action needed to get to 2 degree maximum increase in temperature, et cetera, et cetera. But we all know in private that's not really going to happen, and that's not true, and so on. And essentially, admitted, I can't remember the exact quote, but that they don't really think a lot of the things they say in public. And I suppose, in that context, why should we, of course they're going to say for PR reasons that they're in favour of action on climate change. Why should we ever believe that's what they're actually calling for behind closed doors? And that's certainly not what they're acting on the basis of. The basic fact is that the spreadsheets of Shell and BP are based on asset wealth in oil wells across the world that, if they were burnt, if that wealth was ever realised, would fry the planet. So those companies are, by any basic climate equation, bankrupt, and they know that fine well.
Adam, can I answer that question?
Oh yeah, Sonny, come in.
I actually don't think that BP and Shell are serious about this, and we don't know, in fact, if BP and Shell are serious about it, although they claim. But I think other companies will fill that space instead and create that. There's another solar energy company now, which is actually near the size of Exxon, I believe, in market capitalization. But I think that more broadly, I expect and I respect the fact that socialists like yourself and others on the panel don't believe that market systems can change everything and don't believe that this is going to be enough. That's fine. I don't expect you to think any different. But my argument is a little bit different here, which is that people who are environmentalists, people like myself, who want to still create a 60% majority out there who want to take bold action on the planet, will still need to speak to people beyond socialists, right? And so we also, and people like XR, if they really want to reach out to the broader public and not just socialists, they have to speak to those people as well. People on their doorstep who are not going to be interested in worrying about billionaires who own the press. And I'm serious. You think that's a popular issue on the doorstep? It's not. So, the point of the matter is that we still have to speak to those people. So we have to decouple also the environmental movement and the socialist movement. And if you're in the environmentalist movement, then you have to think about a complete spectrum here of people with different messages. And I hope that that is what Extinction Rebellion is, and that they actually think very hard about how do they reach people in the center and how do they reach people on the right who are currently not convinced and think that this is an entirely socialist movement. That is why I defend them, not because I'm here to defend socialism or criticize it. I'm here to say the environmentalist movement has to talk to everyone, and if it doesn't talk to everyone, then it's going to have a problem. The planet is going to have a problem. I can't wait around for the socialists to get their act together and win elections, right? So I have to speak to people outside that movement and also convince them that this matters to them and matters to their lives as people who live in rural areas and have conservative values, you see.
Gaya, I'm going to come to you
Yeah,
next.
I just saw somebody in the chat say XR aren't here to win elections. They're here to create a mass movement to change the conversation. And I think, you know, this idea that we should bring people with us, we absolutely should. And I think Adrienne very articulately pointed out that we're not telling everybody to get the word socialist tattooed on their forehead. It's just like a simple recognition of the fact. And the thing is, like, yes, we can take 80% of the people with us, but if there's a train coming down the tracks at you and you only get 80% off the tracks, you're still dead. So there's no point trying to like create a message that takes the majority of people with us when your solutions won't work. When we're facing a crisis, something has to be achieved and you will still fail to do it. Because look, we've been following market-based mechanisms for 20 years. I've been working in climate change for 18 years. I've seen, you know, carbon trading, emissions trading, a payment for ecosystem services. They've been trying them for 20 years. The European Union has one of the biggest carbon trading systems in the world. I think there was a study done recently, and it's helped to reduce emissions by about 3.8% on top of what it would have. This is not the scale of change that we're going to be able to save ourselves with, and I don't see the point of lying about it. You don't have to call it socialism, but you do have to call it anti-capitalist, because that's the problem. And like I said, there are plenty of great anti-capitalist movements, the indigenous movement. Some of the strongest critiques of cap and trade systems in the US are coming from Native American-led movements here. And they would never call themselves socialists, and that is fine with me. But if these movements don't like correctly identify the problem and correctly identify the type of transition needed across multiple sectors. I mean, we've just been talking about energy. We need to transform agriculture, transport. How do you essentially transform the entire society within 10 years by simply using market-based mechanisms? It's just not possible. And we need to call it out, because we owe it to the next generation to not lie to ourselves and to be wed to this idea that we need to bring everybody along with us, and therefore we can't use scary terms, even if the solution lies within something that might be unfamiliar.
And that is our hour. So thank you so much to all of our panel for joining us. Thank you for the audience. And I want to say, you know, given we've all seen the chat, I feel like you've all sort of been part of the panel too. We've had some great chat on the side, as well as the speakers we've had here. I don't think we've, you know, necessarily all persuaded each other and come to some cozy consensus, but this debate will continue to rage. I am you know, delighted to have hosted it here at Open Democracy. We have a weekly conversation like this at Open Democracy. You can find out about it if you sign up to our newsletter, which is at opendemocracy.net/newsletter. You can you know, give us money. We can't do any of this stuff without money. We talked before about some of the problems that people might think there are in the kind of more corporate-owned media, and you'll be, you know, glad to know that we're not like that. But that's only because we you know, get funding from other sources, and some of those sources are people like you. So please do contribute at support.opendemocracy.net/donate. And most importantly, please do share this debate online. The webinar the recording will pop up on the website in the coming days, and continue to let the discussion rage. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.